So the Las Vegas Raiders have went out and signed a quarterback in Desmond Ridder, and I am fired up for this signing, man. I think the Raiders did a really good job by bringing in another quarterback because this sends signals across the board that this season's not over and we are not tanking this season. We are looking forward to winning football games. We're looking forward to continue to build and get better. And we're going to talk about Desmond Ridder and Maxx Crosby. We'll talk about him later on. Also gave us an update on why he's not quitting on the Raiders, why he's not looking to be traded regardless of the fact that people are saying, he's a Detroit Lions fan, so he's headed to Detroit. Some people are saying maybe a team like the Texans could jump in and potentially make a trade for Maxx Crosby. Crosby's not going anywhere. He made that pretty known. But let's get right into a quarterback in which the Raiders brought off of the Arizona Cardinals practice squad. To me, I love this pick for the Las Vegas Raiders. Not because I think Desmond Ridder is going to be a great quarterback for the Raiders and he can become the next superstar quarterback in the NFL. I don't think that with Desmond Ridder, but I think it does give you some hope. It does give you a little bit of potential. And he does give you more upside than I think what the Raiders have shown up to this point. If you guys ask me in the offseason who's a better quarterback, Desmond Ridder or Gardner Minshew, and if you guys told me that Kyle Shanahan's going to be the coach, right, essentially he's going to be the offensive coach, who would you want to run his scheme and system? No question about it, right? Hands down, the guy I would have picked is going to be Gardner Minshew, right? He's more experienced. He has a lot more playing time in the NFL. He's a better decision maker at this point. And we'll talk about Ridder's tape here in a second. But, Gardner Minshew, if you asked me this offseason, I would have told you 100% of the time is better than Desmond Ridder, right? But if you ask me who has more upside, if you ask me who has that unknown variable where you don't really know what this guy's going to be, I would have told you that's Desmond Ridder. And I think there's some real upside with a kid like Desmond Ridder. This guy was a former third-round pick. He wasn't a sixth or seventh-round pick. He was a third-round pick. The Atlanta Falcons head coach at that time, Arthur Smith, handpicked Ridder. Arthur Smith is the current offensive coordinator of the Pittsburgh Steelers. This guy handpicked Desmond Ridder to come in and potentially run the offense in the future. And they actually gave this kid an opportunity in 2023, which was his second official year. And it didn't really work out. You guys can see some of his stats. In his first year, he only played in 4 games. He only had 2 touchdowns. In his second season, he had 12 touchdowns through the year. He did have 12 interceptions, and he did ultimately get benched. But in his second year, Desmond Ridder has 17 total touchdowns, right? He had 5 touchdowns on the ground. And he did win some games, right? He did ultimately end up winning 6 games in his second year. But the thing I like with Desmond Ridder is there's the unknown variable with Ridder, right? He's the one guy that you don't really know what his upside is. And to me, that excites me a little bit because what I've seen with the Raiders quarterbacks right now does not have me excited. Like, I would look at the Raiders quarterback situation right now and say, I'm out on these guys. None of these 2 guys are going to be able to get it done. And the thing is it's not that they can't get it done. I think the bigger issue is Luke Getsy. And I think with that, this kind of hindered those 2 quarterbacks. And neither of those quarterbacks are super explosive. They're not super fast. They're not super quick. And I think that's always kind of been one of the factors as well with the Raiders. Even Gardner Minshew, Minshew does create plays with his legs. And we all see it, right? Unless you're biased, unless you're not looking for it and you're putting it to the side. We know Gardner Minshew makes plays with his legs, but we also understand he's not super explosive, right? Gardner Minshew's not outrunning defensive ends and linebackers. Desmond Ridder can, right? Desmond Ridder is actually very, very, very fast. This guy has legit 4.4 speed, right? Desmond Ridder is very, very, very explosive. And I think with the Raiders, it's one of the things you got to keep in mind that this guy could potentially bring to the Raiders. And another thing we have to recognize is, imagine Luke Getsy running read option. Imagine this guy running run-pass options where Ridder maybe even has an opportunity to run with the football. He doesn't always have to necessarily throw it. But think about all the different elements that Getsy kind of runs, and think about a guy like Desmond Ridder who's more athletic. He's more explosive. He's quicker. He's faster. He has a bigger arm, right? I think that's another thing with Ridder is this guy has a massive arm. Now, by massive arm, I mean he has power. He can throw the ball well deep. But he does miss guys open sometimes, right? We've kind of seen that with Gardner Minshew. Aiden has a much better arm, I think, than both of these guys. But there's an unknown variable with a guy like Ridder, and I'm excited for the Raiders to see what this guy can do, for the Raiders. At this point, the Raiders have Gardner Minshew as their starting quarterback. And then we have the young UDFA and Carter Bradley. But even then, Bradley, he's looked good in the preseason, but the preseason is not the regular season, right? The regular season is a completely different beast. Right? although I would love to see Carter Bradley play at some point, I'd rather watch Desmond Ridder play, right? This guy's actually been a starting quarterback in the NFL. This guy's actually went out there and he's actually seen the mixed coverages. He's played against multiple teams. This guy's essentially done it. He's failed, and now he might get another opportunity to potentially do it again. Remember, we've seen guys like Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield go out, team to team to team, fail, and now they're both guys that are, dominating essentially the NFL, right? I think between the two guys, they have like 9 or 10 wins with those two teams, right? They're both about like 4 or 5 wins each. To me, that's incredible for two guys that most people have written off. And again, I'm not saying Desmond Ridder is going to take that same leap. I'm not saying that at all. But it at least excites me that the Raiders are not tanking this season and they're looking forward to potentially finding a quarterback that can have a little bit of success. Now, Ridder might not start for the next 2 to 3 weeks, right? This guy has to learn the playbook. He has to recognize the Getty scheme and system. He has to get used to it and kind of just go through the motions. I will say that, Arthur Smith's offensive scheme that he ran with Falcons isn't that much different than what Luke Getsy kind of does. Formation-wise, very similar. Passing concepts, a lot of it's very, very similar. The verbiage will be a little bit different, so Ridder will have to kind of learn those things. But I like the signing, man. It's a former third-round pick. There's upside with this kid, right? When I watched his tape from the preseason with the Cardinals, there's a ton of upside, right? This guy can make his reads, right? He's able to push the ball downfield. He's not scared to actually push the ball. And I don't know if that's a positive or a negative thing because we've kind of seen with Gardner Minshew, the guy was a turnover machine. But I do think that, you learn from actually going out there and playing, from gaining experience. And if you have traits, right, if you have things that can potentially be molded, you might have a chance to actually succeed. Remember, the Raiders don't have to win, 15 games this season. We just got to be consistent, and we just got to be able to win a few games this season, right? We just got to be able to, maybe you win 2 or 3 straight. Maybe you're 5-4, or, maybe you're in a situation where now you're 6-7, and maybe you win 3 or 4 more games and you sneak into the playoffs, right? And again, I'm not saying that that's 100% what's going to happen this season, but I think there's also a realistic aspect to all of the quarterback talk that people are talking about, which is the Raiders might not get a quarterback this offseason. I've talked about the fact that I think this quarterback class has a potential to be really, really, really good. Well, there's some people now that I've talked to that are saying this class is actually going to be really, really, really bad. That too, a lot of the quarterbacks that are potentially coming out are actually juniors, so a lot of them are going to most likely return back to school for another season. In fact, I think like more than half the quarterbacks are going to end up going back. The only quarterback that might end up coming out this year is going to be Shedeur Sanders. He's probably the only guy that's going to end up being a first-round pick. And I think Cam Ward's the other guy that people love. I would probably put Ward ahead of Shedeur Sanders. And some people are saying Sanders might not even be a first-round pick. Right? Some people actually think that about him. So with that, there's a chance the Raiders don't even get a quarterback in this class. Right? We might actually end up just waiting a whole nother year for the Raiders to go out and draft the quarterback. And I know some people might not want to hear that, but I do also want to put it into perspective. If you're the Las Vegas Raiders and you're sure you're going to go forward with Antonio Pierce, do you really want to go out and get a quarterback that too? You don't really know if this quarterback's going to end up being good, especially since you'll end up having to reach, unless you have the first or second overall pick. That too, there might only be one quarterback that's a first round caliber quarterback, right? I think at this point, it's just too early for all that. So I think at this point, the Raiders have to be realistic. And when you look at a guy like Desmond Ridder, although he's shown inconsistencies, I'm not 100% sure if you're looking to this draft and saying you're 100% going to draft the guy, and he's 100% going to be better than Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew or Desmond Ridder, right? I think for the Raiders, you got to try to win some football games. And you got to try to figure out how you're going to kind of go forward. Now, Maxx Crosby had some interesting things to say, but before we get into that, the Raiders went out and actually signed wide receiver Terrace Marshall, and I want to talk about this here really quickly because I think this is a very, very important thing that the Raiders did that I don't think people recognize enough. So the Raiders, ever since we got rid of Devontae Adams, have had a shift in the roles of our guys, right? So if you guys look at it in NFL terms, right, most guys are going to be labeled either the X, some guys will be labeled the Z, some guys will be labeled the Y. But essentially how you can really, put it into more basic terms, you essentially have a tight end, right? The Raiders have that. You have a guy that's a true number 1 wide receiver, and then you have a guy that's essentially a number 2 wide receiver. Now, your number 2 wide receiver isn't always, just your second best wide receiver. It doesn't work like that, right? We've seen guys like, for example, Trey Tucker. We've seen a guy like Brandon Cooks. These guys are not true number 2 wide receivers. None of these guys are, right? These guys are more of slot wide receivers. They're guys that run fast. They run deep. You throw them the ball 2 or 3 times deep. That's pretty much it. They're not going to be guys that are number 1 wide receivers. They're not guys that are going to absolutely beat coverage. You know, they're guys that you kind of get the ball to when you can, but they're not real wide receivers that can make things kind of happen. So the Raiders had Devontae, who was their number 1 wide receiver, and then they had Jacoby, who's playing the number 2 wide receiver. Although I think Jacoby Myers is more so of a guy that's kind of mixed. He could also be a number 1 and a number 2. But one of the things I've noticed over the last 2 weeks is our wide receiver situation is really, really, really poor at this moment. And I think the big issue is, of course, Jacoby Myers is hurt. I think when Myers comes back, the Raiders get a lot better. Myers will come back and be our number 1 wide receiver, hopefully this upcoming week against the Chiefs. But we still don't have a number 2 wide receiver, right? Trey Tucker is not a number 2. I think he's pretty much proven that over the last 2 weeks. But Terrace Marshall could actually be a number 2 wide receiver for the Raiders. Even a guy like Michael Gallup, who the Raiders had early on in the offseason, who ended up retiring, he, to me, could have been a true number 2 wide receiver, and I think the Raiders have to get that guy, right? Because you're going to get a guy that's going to get pressed. You're going to get a guy that needs to beat coverages. Trey Tucker hasn't shown us that he can do that, but that doesn't mean he's a bad football player, right? I think Trey Tucker's best trait and his best ability is to really use that speed, go into motion, and keep a defense honest, and I think if you're forcing this guy to run routes, right? Like, let's be honest, most wide receivers run 75% of routes where they're never going to touch the ball, right? If you're putting Trey Tucker as a receiver that's going to run a slant route where he's not going to get the ball, that might not be better. That might not be the best thing you can do with Trey Tucker, right? It might make more sense to put this guy in motion, to make those safeties' eyes look into the backfield, right? So, to me, I like this Terrace Marshall signing. Now, Marshall's by no means an absolute superstar wide receiver. He's by no means one of the best receivers in the NFL or anything like that. But the guy's been okay, right? He had a really good second year. He had 490 yards on 28 catches. His second year, 2022, he was okay. I think the Raiders just need guys that could fit certain roles. And remember, Terrace Marshall as a number 2 wide receiver, what that means is he's running the route concept. He's running and demanding coverages in a specific way. And again, he's not the number 1 option for the Raiders, right? It doesn't mean that at all. In fact, Brock Bowers is the number 1 option for the Raiders right now. When Jacoby Myers is back, he'll be the number 2 guy. But we need a guy to run certain routes. And I think Terrace Marshall can come into the Raiders and potentially provide that. And then we'll still have Trey Tucker doing his thing as well. So I'm excited for the Raiders to continue to add players, right? Try to continue to get better. By no means is Terrace Marshall going to come in and light things up, but hopefully he can play a specific role with the Raiders. Same with Desmond Ridder. We'll kind of see how that kind of pans out. And then lastly, let's talk a little bit about our superstar, Maxx Crosby. Maxx Crosby was asked the question about him potentially being traded, and I'm going to just let you guys listen into this.
They've started a whole,
movement,
pandemonium, a
it's
whole
a revolution.
movement, like a revolution. And it's like, I'm sitting here innocently just doing what I do.
Yep.
And I feel like, I got to address it with my teammates. You know what I mean? I'm like, I'm not trying to leave. You know what I mean? I know it's a business. You know what I mean? I don't have 100% control, all that, but I want to be here. I want to be silver and black. I'll say it loud and clear. I want to be a Raider. I've said that over and over and over again. But yeah, it's business part of it too. I don't have 100% control of that, but I know at the end of the day, just seeing all the craziness, it's been insane. You know what I mean? I can't even open my phone.
So there you guys have it, man. Maxx Crosby is making it known that he wants to be here. He wants to be with the silver and black. And I'll say it loud, man, loud and clear. I want to be a Raider. I love Maxx Crosby addressing these rumors and really shutting it down and letting people know. The one thing that's different with Maxx Crosby than a guy like Devontae is with Devontae, we've always known this guy's kind of fake. We've always kind of known that this guy wasn't, the things he was putting out there weren't real. Right? A lot of the stuff he would say, he was kind of trolling. He'd take this approach where he wasn't super serious, right? If that makes sense. And with Max, it's completely different. Maxx Crosby, if he was unhappy and he really didn't want to be here, he wouldn't drag it on, right? It wouldn't take 2 or 3 weeks for the rumors to start and back and forth. We would know right away Maxx Crosby doesn't want to be here, and he'd make it known, and essentially he'd be gone within a week, right? Maxx Crosby saying he wants to be with the Raiders means to me he wants to actually be with the Raiders. Maxx Crosby has done nothing but tell us how much he loves the Las Vegas Raiders, how much he loves this team, the organization, the history, and how he wants to be one of the all-time greats. And of course, he's on pace for that right now, right? Within the Raiders team history, even in the NFL, generally speaking, he's one of, potentially all-time greats if he just continues to play at this level. But for the Raiders, he's definitely going to be one of those guys. And the thing with Maxx Crosby is he's trying to change the culture. He's trying to get us into this winning direction, and he's trying to make it so we can have success as a football team. This guy doesn't want to go anywhere, and he's made it known. Now, some people speculated with Max, not only because of the Devontae Adams trade and the fact that we haven't been very good, but this guy posted something on his Instagram story. Someone tagged Maxx Crosby saying, "Hey, come on home," and he reposted that. Keep in mind the repost was the Eastern Michigan football field, which is named after Maxx Crosby. And the Instagram post had "come back home." He just reposted it, something he was tagged in. I don't think it really meant anything other than that. But from what I know, Maxx Crosby's a fan of the Detroit Lions, right? So people are saying that's a natural fit for the Lions. They lost Aiden Hutchinson. It just make a ton of sense to bring in Max. I don't think that makes sense, right? Not only can they not afford it, but it just doesn't make sense for the Raiders. Maxx Crosby's young, right? Next year, things could be completely different. Next year, we might have Ben Johnson or Bobby Slowick running our entire team. And maybe we do end up getting Shadur Sanders, or maybe it's Jalen Milroe, and maybe those guys decide to come out, right? Milroe or Miller Moss, and Bobby Slowick thinks that those guys are the next superstar quarterbacks, so the Raiders take one of those guys. Next year, the Raiders could actually be a legit football team. And, with Maxx Crosby, he's young. He can stay 2, 3, 4 years until the Raiders turn it around. And we're not the Carolina Panthers. And I said this yesterday, and people disagreed with me. The Raiders are not the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers don't have talent on their team. Most people can't even name one player on the Carolina Panthers defense. The Raiders have 2 all-pro players just on our defensive side. That doesn't include guys with all-pro upside. Guys like Malcolm Koonce. Guys like Robert Spillane. Guys like Jack Jones and Jacorian Bennett. I know Jack Jones hasn't played great this year, but he's a good football player nonetheless. And Jacorian Bennett's starting to break out a little bit. Trayvon Merrick looks good. Divine Diablo, Isaiah Palomalo look good. Those guys are actually good players. We actually have some superstar caliber players on this team. The Carolina Panthers, no one can name anyone off that roster, right? So the Raiders aren't that far away. We have pieces. We have Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is probably better than every player on the Carolina Panthers. And I know we lost the Carolina Panthers, but my point is my point. The Raiders have talent. Let's not get that confused. What we don't have is we don't have a good offensive coordinator. We don't have a guy that's super, super smart and play designs and play concepts. And we don't have a leader on the team at the quarterback position, at least not yet, right? And it only takes the Raiders to get those 2 things from them going from a team that's 2-5 to a team that's 5-2. I can guarantee you guys that right now. The Raiders aren't actually that far away. That's why I'm hopeful for Desmond Ridder to potentially help the Raiders. Maybe you win 4, 5, 6 games in a row. Even if you miss the playoffs, at the end of the day, you kind of show that you can win and you continue to build. Maybe there's really no good quarterback coming into this class. So then you go with Desmond Ridder next year, right? If it's not Ridder, maybe it's Aiden O'Connell. Maybe he shows something in the final few weeks when he gets back. We'll see what ends up happening. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, consider subscribing, and I will see you guys next time with another video.